The economic downturn is no longer a distant threat, it's a present reality. As of 2025, the foundation of the American economy shows deep fractures. Household debt has surged to unprecedented levels while unemployment figures climb steadily. But the national numbers don't tell the full story. The real danger lies at the state level, where years of financial mismanagement have left many governments dangerously exposed. Some states are operating with fiscal reserves that could evaporate in weeks, not months. Others are crushed by overwhelming pension obligations and the collapse of key local industries. While the entire nation braces for impact, a handful of states are already on the brink. We're about to reveal the 10 states positioned to fail first as the economic crisis unfolds. The warning lights are flashing, and for millions, the collapse is already at their doorstep. 10. New Mexico, the land of unstable enchantment. Often overlooked on the national stage, New Mexico is a state whose quiet fragility is poised to become a deafening crisis in a recession. Its economy is a high-wire act performed without a safety net, dangerously reliant on a single volatile industry. With a population of just over 2.1 million, its economic base is alarmingly narrow. Over 31% of the state's total revenue is directly tied to oil and gas production taxes. This dependency transforms the state budget into a direct reflection of global energy markets. As demand softens and prices fluctuate wildly in 2025, New Mexico's financial stability doesn't just dip, it plummets. This isn't a slow leak, it's a catastrophic blowout waiting to happen. A downturn in the energy sector sends immediate and devastating shockwaves through every public service, from education to healthcare. The state's financial preparedness for such a shock is practically non-existent. New Mexico's rainy day fund holds enough to cover a mere 7.1% of its annual spending. This figure is well below the benchmark recommended for fiscal stability, leaving the government with only a few weeks of cushion before it must implement draconian cuts. Schools, hospitals, and critical infrastructure projects become the first casualties when revenue streams dry up. Compounding this fiscal vulnerability is a deep-seated poverty crisis. An alarming 18.5% of New Mexicans live below the poverty line, one of the highest rates in the nation. Food insecurity is a harsh reality for nearly 13% of households, a number sure to surge as economic pressures mount. Even before the full force of a recession hits, the housing market in key cities like Albuquerque and Santa Fe is showing signs of significant strain. Median home prices, while appearing robust at $369,000, are dangerously misaligned with local earning power. The median household income languishes at just $61,000, stretching family budgets to their absolute limit and creating a housing affordability crisis. This imbalance is reflected in rising debt, with the average household carrying over $39,000 in consumer debt and delinquency rates climbing faster than the national average. As layoffs begin to mount in mining, construction, and state services, pushing unemployment to 5.5% in mid-2025, the state's reliance on federal aid becomes its final, tenuous lifeline. Should Washington decide to tighten its belt, New Mexico's facade of stability will crumble, revealing a state built on sand. 9. Oregon, the Pacific Paradox. Oregon has carefully cultivated an image of progressive prosperity, a Pacific Northwest haven of tech innovation, green ideals, and artisanal everything. But beneath this veneer of success, the state's economic structure is riddled with weaknesses that are becoming glaringly obvious in 2025. Oregon is a paradox, a state promoting a high quality of life that is increasingly unaffordable for its 4.3 million residents. Its fiscal foundation is alarmingly precarious. The state's rainy day fund is a pittance, covering just 6.4% of annual expenditures. This leaves Oregon with virtually no buffer to absorb the shock of a recession. Even more troubling is the state's massive pension crisis. Unfunded pension liabilities have ballooned past $28 billion, a ticking time bomb that represents one of the most severe shortfalls in the western United States. As tax revenues inevitably decline with the slowing economy, the state will be forced into an impossible choice: default on its promises to public sector retirees, or gut the very services its citizens depend on. The most visible sign of Oregon's impending crisis is its runaway housing market. The median home price in the Portland metro area has soared to $531,000, while the statewide median is not far behind at $479,000. These prices are completely disconnected from the financial reality of most Oregonians, with the median household income at a modest $77,000. This has created a severe cost of living crisis, where an astonishing 34% of residents are classified as cost-burdened, spending over a third of their income just on housing. The tech sector, once the engine of Portland's Silicon Forest, is now sputtering. Layoffs have become commonplace, driving the state's unemployment rate up to 7% from a low of 8% just 18 months prior. The slowdown is rippling through the economy, with construction projects stalling and the state's GDP contracting by 8% in the first quarter of 2025 alone. This economic strain is exacerbated by a homelessness crisis that has reached epidemic proportions, giving Oregon the second highest rate of unhoused individuals per capita in the nation. The state's legacy industries are not faring any better. Agriculture, particularly in the fertile Willamette Valley, is being hammered by persistent drought conditions, and wine exports, once a celebrated growth sector, have fallen by 9%. Oregon's prosperity was built on a narrow set of industries and the assumption of perpetual growth. As that assumption shatters, the state's deep-seated issues of debt, unaffordability, and fiscal weakness are pulling it toward a rapid and painful collapse. 8. Michigan, the Rust Belt relapse. Michigan, once the formidable arsenal of democracy, now finds itself armed with an arsenal of economic collapse. The state's lingering dependence on the automotive industry has once again become its Achilles heel in 2025. With nearly 10.1 million residents, Michigan's fate remains inextricably chained to a manufacturing sector that grinds to a halt whenever global consumer demand falters. The auto industry, which accounts for a massive 17% of the state's GDP, is already in turmoil. As consumer enthusiasm for electric vehicles cools and complex supply chain costs continue to rise, major automakers have announced tens of thousands of layoffs. This is not a distant threat. The impact is immediate and severe. In the first quarter of 2025, Michigan's GDP shrank by a staggering 1.3%, one of the most precipitous declines in the entire country. The unemployment rate has surged to 6.1%, a direct consequence of the bleeding in the manufacturing sector, with the city of Detroit alone losing over 27,000 jobs since the start of the year. Beyond the auto plants, deep-seated economic issues persist. Entrenched poverty remains a blight on the state, with 16% of all Michiganders living below the poverty line. Entire regions, particularly in the Upper Peninsula, are mired in economic stagnation, left behind by decades of industrial decline. The state's fiscal preparedness is woefully inadequate for the coming storm. Its rainy day fund covers a mere 8% of annual spending, a thin buffer against the revenue plunge that is already underway. Meanwhile, Michigan is staring down the barrel of over $35 billion in unfunded pension obligations, a financial black hole that will necessitate devastating cuts to public services. The housing market adds another layer of dread. While the statewide median home price is a relatively modest $242,000, this figure masks a brewing disaster in its urban centers. In Detroit, property values have plummeted by nearly 12% year over year, plunging thousands of families back into the nightmare of negative equity that defined the 2008 crash. The state's infrastructure is not just aging, it is actively collapsing. Over 1,200 bridges across Michigan are deemed structurally deficient, and the specter of the Flint water crisis serves as a constant, horrifying reminder of systemic failure. For Michigan, an economic collapse isn't a new phenomenon, it's a recurring trauma. The warning signs today are not just echoes of the past. They are screaming a prelude to a devastating relapse. 7. Florida, the Sunshine State's shadow economy. Florida has been masterfully marketed as America's sun-drenched paradise, a beacon of low taxes and endless growth. But in 2025, this paradise is revealing its true nature, a financial powder keg built on some of the most unstable economic pillars imaginable. The state's explosive growth, which has swelled its population to 22.5 million, is predicated on a fragile trifecta of tourism, speculative real estate, and a vast low-wage service economy. This model thrives in boom times but is destined for a catastrophic failure during a downturn. The state's fiscal cushion is dangerously thin, with a rainy day fund that covers only 7% of its yearly expenditures. This is a shockingly small buffer for a state whose entire budget is hostage to the discretionary spending of tourists. The moment visitors decide to stay home, as they are beginning to do, Florida's economy nosedives. In early 2025, tourism revenue has already fallen 11% year over year. Hotel occupancy rates in Orlando are in free fall, and even the mighty Disney has announced rolling layoffs, signaling a deep chill in its most vital industry. Housing, the second pillar of Florida's economy, is an even greater point of pressure. The median home price has been bid up to an unsustainable $420,000, a figure completely detached from the earning power of its residents, where the median household income is a mere $67,900. This has created a crisis of affordability, leaving millions financially exposed and trapped. Nearly 40% of renters are now spending over half of their income on housing, one of the most severe burdens in the entire nation. Then there is the insurance catastrophe. As the risk of devastating hurricanes intensifies with climate change, the insurance market has imploded. Premiums for home insurance have more than doubled since 2021, and multiple major insurers have fled the state entirely, refusing to write new policies. This leaves homeowners with an impossible choice: pay astronomical rates that cripple their finances or go without coverage, risking total financial ruin. The cracks are already showing in the broader economy. Florida's GDP contracted by 0.7% in the first quarter of 2025, and unemployment has climbed to 5.9%. With the heaviest job losses concentrated in the vulnerable construction and hospitality sectors. As household debt averages $46,300 and delinquencies rise, a larger existential threat looms: the environmental crisis. Coastal erosion and rising sea levels are projected to obliterate $300 billion in real estate value by 2050. When the national recession deepens, Florida's house of cards will not just wobble, it will collapse in spectacular fashion. 6. Pennsylvania, the Keystone State's crushing weight. Pennsylvania, the Keystone State, projects an image of sturdy, diversified resilience, a blend of heavy industry, rich farmland, and modern finance. Yet this image is a facade, masking deep-seated structural weaknesses that make it one of the most fragile states in a national recession. Its most significant vulnerability is demographic. With a population of 12.9 million, Pennsylvania has one of the oldest populations in America. Nearly 21% of its residents are over the age of 65. This demographic reality places an immense and ever-growing strain on state-funded healthcare systems like Medicaid, with costs spiraling upward and consuming a larger share of the budget each year. The state's financial preparedness to handle this, let alone a recession, is perilously weak. The rainy day fund covers a scant 7.2% of annual expenditures, offering little protection from a revenue shortfall. More alarmingly, Pennsylvania is being crushed by over $60 billion in unfunded pension liabilities, the fifth largest pension deficit in the nation. This is not a future problem. It is a present crisis that will force devastating choices between honoring commitments to retirees and funding essential public services. The economic warning signs are already flashing red across the state. In the first quarter of 2025, Pennsylvania's GDP contracted by 0.6%, a downturn propelled by significant layoffs in its traditional backbone industries: steel, logistics, and energy. Consequently, the unemployment rate has climbed to 5.8%, with post-industrial cities like Pittsburgh and Erie bearing the brunt of the job losses. The housing market, once a bastion of affordability, is becoming a source of intense pressure. While the statewide median home price of $295,000 may seem reasonable, it is increasingly out of reach for a population with a median household income of just $70,000. In major urban centers like Philadelphia, the situation is acute. Rents have skyrocketed 17% in just 2 years, and eviction filings have surged by 24% since 2023. This financial strain is reflected in household balance sheets, with consumer debt averaging $43,900 and mortgage delinquencies on the rise. The state's infrastructure is literally crumbling, with over 300 bridges rated as structurally deficient. At the same time, its investment in the future is faltering, ranking 42nd in per-student education spending. When the national recession deepens, the Keystone State will not be a source of stability. It will be one of the first major pillars to crack under its own immense weight. 5. Illinois, the Prairie State's fiscal freefall. Illinois stands as a cautionary tale of fiscal mismanagement, a state whose economic foundation has been eroding for decades, leaving it terrifyingly exposed to the shock of a national downturn. With a population of 12.5 million, Illinois is home to the world-class city of Chicago. But beyond the gleaming skyline lies a state in a perpetual state of financial crisis. The single most catastrophic issue is its pension system, which is arguably the worst funded in the entire nation. The state is suffocating under an unfunded pension liability that has spiraled past an astronomical $140 billion. This isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It's a fiscal black hole that consumes nearly a quarter of the state's annual budget just to make minimum payments. This leaves precious little for education, infrastructure, or social services, and in a recession, when tax revenues plummet, the state will face an impossible Sophie's choice between defaulting on its obligations and gutting what remains of public services. The state's rainy day fund is a cruel joke, holding enough to run the government for less than a week, offering zero buffer against economic headwinds. The economic pain is already being felt on the ground in 2025. Illinois' GDP contracted by 0.9% in the first quarter, a decline fueled by weakness in its manufacturing and transportation sectors. The unemployment rate has risen to 6.3%, with job losses accelerating in the industrial corridors outside of Chicago. For years, the state has been experiencing a slow-motion population decline as residents flee the high taxes and lack of opportunity. This out-migration of taxpayers, particularly high-income earners, further shrinks the revenue base needed to pay its colossal debts, creating a death spiral. The housing market in many parts of the state remains stagnant, with property values in some downstate communities still below their 2008 peaks. Yet residents are burdened by some of the highest property taxes in the country, a desperate measure by local governments to stay afloat. This tax burden crushes homeowners and makes the state deeply unattractive for business investment. Consumer debt averages a high $51,000 per household, and with rising unemployment, delinquencies on mortgages and auto loans are ticking upward. Illinois is not just unprepared for a recession, it is already in the midst of a slow-motion collapse. A national economic crisis won't create a problem for Illinois. It will simply accelerate the inevitable, pushing the state from chronic crisis into acute system failure. 4. Alabama, the heart of Dixie's breaking point. Marketed as the heart of Dixie, Alabama's economy is poised to have a cardiac arrest as the nation slides into recession. The state's economic identity is deeply interwoven with industries that are notoriously sensitive to economic cycles: auto manufacturing, aerospace, and steel. This lack of diversification creates extreme vulnerability. When consumer demand for new cars weakens or federal defense spending tightens, the shockwaves are felt immediately across Alabama. Already in 2025, the Hyundai plant in Montgomery has announced rolling furloughs, and aerospace subcontractors in the Huntsville area are cutting jobs. The impact is stark and measurable. Alabama's GDP shrank by a severe 1.2% in the first quarter, one of the most significant contractions in the South. Factory output has plummeted nearly 8% year over year, and the unemployment rate has jumped to 6.2%, leaving over 35,000 people jobless since the beginning of the year. These immediate economic pains are layered on top of profound, long-term structural weaknesses. Alabama is the seventh poorest state in the nation, with a staggering 17.9% of its 1 million residents living below the poverty line. This means nearly 1 in 5 people are in a state of financial distress even before a full-blown recession takes hold. Wages are stagnant, with a median household income of just $57,800 among the lowest in the United States. While the median home price of $228,000 seems affordable on a national scale, it is a major burden for local incomes, leaving 36% of homeowners cost-burdened. The state's financial safety net is virtually non-existent. Its rainy day fund holds enough to cover only 6.3% of annual spending. Any significant drop in tax revenue will force immediate and brutal cuts to already underfunded public schools, rural hospitals, and crumbling infrastructure. Over 16% of Alabama's bridges are officially classified as structurally deficient, and many rural communities face failing water systems. The state also ranks 46th in access to health care, a dire statistic for a population that will desperately need it as jobs and insurance coverage disappear. Alabama doesn't just face financial stress in a recession. It faces a complete systems breakdown where high poverty, failing infrastructure, and a volatile economy converge into a perfect storm of collapse. 3. West Virginia, the canary's last gasp. West Virginia has long served as the canary in America's economic coal mine, and in 2025, that canary is no longer singing, it is suffocating. This is a state whose profound economic and demographic challenges make it acutely susceptible to a national downturn. With a small population of just 1.75 million, its problems are disproportionately large. Systemic poverty is one of the most glaring issues, with nearly 14% of the population living below the poverty line, the 4th highest rate in the country. This economic precarity is underscored by a median household income of only $54,300, a figure that lags nearly $20,000 behind the national average. For a significant portion of the population, there is no financial cushion. A single unexpected event, like a medical emergency or a sudden job loss, is enough to trigger a complete household collapse. The state's own financial cushion is just as thin. Its rainy day fund can cover a dangerously low 4% of annual spending, offering virtually no defense against a collapse in tax revenue. When that revenue inevitably falls, critical services like schools and rural hospitals will face immediate and severe funding crises. The economic engine that once powered West Virginia, coal, is now in a state of terminal decline. Production has cratered by over 65% since its peak, and the global shift toward renewable energy is accelerating this collapse in 2025. This is a death blow for a state where coal still represents nearly 15% of its GDP. Layoffs in the energy sector are mounting, pushing the unemployment rate to 6.4%, as over 12,000 jobs have vanished in the first half of the year alone. The tragedy is that there is no viable industry ready to take coal's place. The manufacturing sector is stagnant, tourism remains underdeveloped, and agriculture is a negligible part of the economy. This lack of diversification resulted in the state's GDP contracting by a shocking 5% in the first quarter of 2025, one of the worst performances nationwide. The housing market offers no solace. A median home price of just $160,000 isn't a sign of affordability, but a stark reflection of economic decay and population flight. Young working-age residents are leaving in droves, leading to an outright demographic decline. This exodus leaves behind an aging population with 21% of residents over 65. That places an unsustainable burden on healthcare systems. West Virginia isn't just facing a recession, it's staring into the abyss of permanent economic extinction. 2. California, the Golden State's gilded collapse. California, the world's 5th largest economy and America's glittering dream factory, is transforming into a high-stakes financial nightmare. Its colossal size, with nearly 39 million residents, does not provide safety. It magnifies the scale of its impending collapse. The state's finances are built on a foundation of extreme volatility. While its rainy day fund covers 5% of expenditures, this is a woefully inadequate buffer for a budget that is dangerously dependent on the fortunes of the wealthy. Over 45% of California's tax revenue comes from capital gains and the income of its top earners. When the stock market falters, as it has begun to do, the state's revenue doesn't just dip, it evaporates, creating massive, sudden deficits. The first tremors of this collapse are already shaking the state. GDP growth went negative in the first quarter of 2025, contracting by 0.9% as the pillars of its economy, tech, entertainment, and real estate, all began to buckle simultaneously. The unemployment rate has surged to 6.1%, with a brutal wave of layoffs in Silicon Valley erasing over 120,000 high-paying jobs in less than a year. This economic slowdown is colliding with a catastrophic cost of living crisis. The median home price remains at an astronomical $785,000, while median household income stands at just $91,500. This chasm has made the California dream an impossibility for millions. An incredible 44% of renters are severely cost-burdened, spending more than half their income just to keep a roof over their heads, and evictions in Los Angeles County have spiked 28% year over year. Household debt is suffocating the population, with residents carrying an average of $52,000 in personal debt, the second highest in the nation. The social fabric is tearing as a result. The homelessness crisis has exploded into a full-blown humanitarian disaster, with over 181,000 unhoused residents overwhelming public services and city budgets. Beneath the surface, the state's long-term obligations are a ticking time bomb. The state pension system, CalPERS, is facing an unfunded liability that exceeds $170 billion. As if this weren't enough, California is on the front lines of the climate crisis. Wildfires and droughts drain emergency funds and have caused an insurance market collapse, with major providers refusing to offer coverage in high-risk areas. California is a multi-trillion-dollar behemoth teetering on the edge of fiscal chaos. 1. Illinois, ground zero of the collapse. No state in the Union is more structurally compromised or more primed for a rapid and devastating collapse than Illinois. It is the nation's ground zero for fiscal insolvency, a state caught in a perfect storm of insurmountable debt, political dysfunction, and demographic decay. The single issue that guarantees its position at the top of this list is its pension crisis, the most severe in America. Illinois is being crushed by an unfunded pension liability that has soared past a $140 billion sum, more than 3 times its entire annual budget. This is not a distant problem. It is a clear and present danger that has already cannibalized the state's finances, forcing impossible trade-offs between paying for the past and investing in the future. In a recession, as tax revenues plummet, the state will be pushed into default. Its fiscal safety net is non-existent. The rainy day fund is so depleted it could cover state expenditures for less than 1 week, making Illinois the most financially exposed large state in the country. The economic indicators for 2025 paint a picture of a state already in a downward spiral. Illinois's GDP contracted by 1.1% in the first quarter, with its key manufacturing and logistics sectors in retreat. The unemployment rate has climbed to 6.3% and the job losses are accelerating. This economic decline is fueling a mass exodus. For over a decade, Illinois has been bleeding residents, losing population faster than almost any other state as taxpayers flee the high taxes, political corruption, and lack of opportunity. This outmigration creates a demographic death spiral, shrinking the tax base and leaving behind an older, more dependent population to pay for the state's gargantuan debts. Property taxes, already among the highest in the nation, are a primary driver of this flight. Yet local governments are forced to keep raising them to stave off their own insolvency. The state's infrastructure is crumbling, with over 2,300 bridges deemed structurally deficient, and public services are in a state of managed decline. Illinois is not just vulnerable to a recession, it is the embodiment of a systemic failure. When the national economy fully turns, the land of Lincoln will not bend. It will break first, triggering a financial abyss with no bottom in sight.